What will happen to Donald Trump if courts rule Chicago troop use illegal? Imagine this. A former U.S. president facing the possibility that one of his most controversial moves, sending federal troops into Chicago, could be ruled flat out illegal by the courts. Such a ruling wouldn't just be a legal setback, it would strike at the heart of Trump's claim to executive power and his narrative of being a law and order leader. For his supporters, it raises the question, was this about protecting public safety, or was it an abuse of power dressed up as security? For his critics, it could be the moment that validates years of warnings about presidential overreach. Either way, the implications are massive, not only for Trump's legal standing, but for the precedent it sets for future presidents and the balance of power in America. Stay tuned as we break it down right now. The controversy surrounding the deployment of federal forces into Chicago under Donald Trump's direction raises profound questions about the limits of presidential power, the role of civilian law enforcement, and the preservation of constitutional order. When Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker forcefully condemned the deployment, he was not only voicing the concerns of Chicago residents, but also pointing toward a deeper legal and constitutional crisis. The prospect of federal courts ruling that the use of troops in Chicago was illegal could carry immense consequences for Donald Trump personally, politically, and historically. This issue touches upon the foundations of American democracy, the separation of powers, and the delicate balance between federal and state authority. A ruling against Trump's troop deployment would not be an isolated judgment. It would symbolize judicial pushback against attempts to militarize domestic law enforcement, potentially setting a precedent for the future. In this script, we will examine the central questions. What are the constitutional and legal implications? What are the likely political consequences? How might such a ruling reshape Trump's legacy? And what broader lessons does this episode hold for American governance? When Donald Trump considered deploying federal forces into Chicago, he justified the action on the grounds of fighting violent crime and maintaining order. Yet critics, including Governor Pritzker, argued that the true intention was political, an effort to create chaos, suppress dissent, and intimidate communities ahead of elections. The transcript of Pritzker's press conference illustrates this vividly. He expressed shock at the idea of a president invading a city with troops, describing the move as unprecedented and un-American. The use of federal agents and potentially National Guard troops blurred the line between traditional law enforcement and military presence. Civilian law enforcement agencies like the FBI, DEA, and ATF are tasked with working alongside local police to combat crime. By contrast, troops are trained for war, not for managing protests or enforcing local law. The decision to insert them into Chicago, according to Pritzker, reflected not a commitment to public safety but an effort to assert federal dominance and undermine democratic norms. This context is critical to understanding why a potential court ruling on illegality matters. The dispute was not simply about tactics for reducing crime. It was about whether the executive branch had the authority to bypass state leaders, disregard constitutional limitations, and deploy armed forces into an American city absent genuine emergency conditions. To understand the consequences for Trump, if the courts were to rule the Chicago deployment illegal, we must first examine the legal framework that governs domestic use of troops. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 forms the backbone of restrictions on military involvement in domestic law enforcement. This act generally prohibits the use of the U.S. Army and Air Force in executing domestic laws except where expressly authorized by Congress or the Constitution. Over time, this principle has been extended informally to the Navy and Marine Corps. The National Guard, when operating under state control, can engage in domestic missions, but when federalized under presidential authority, its activities are subject to the same restrictions as active duty military. The Insurrection Act of 1807 provides limited exceptions, allowing the president to deploy troops domestically in cases of rebellion, insurrection, or when states are unable or unwilling to enforce federal law. However, such deployments must be tied to extraordinary circumstances. The mere existence of urban crime or protests does not meet the high bar intended by the law. For Trump's decision to be justified, he would have needed to demonstrate that local law enforcement was unable to manage the crisis, and that the situation rose to the level of insurrection or rebellion. Governor Pritzker's statements made clear that Illinois did not request assistance, and that no such emergency existed. Therefore, if courts were to rule Trump's troop use illegal, they would likely determine that he exceeded his statutory and constitutional authority, misapplied the Insurrection Act, and violated the principles of the Posse Comitatus Act. Such a ruling would set a firm legal boundary, underscoring that presidents cannot invoke vague claims of crime control to militarize domestic cities. If federal courts ultimately rule that Trump's deployment of troops to Chicago was illegal, several legal ramifications could follow. First, Trump could face civil lawsuits from individuals who were directly harmed by the troop presence. If residents were unlawfully detained, injured, or intimidated by federal forces acting outside legal authority, they might sue both the federal government and, indirectly, Trump in his official capacity. Although former presidents enjoy certain immunities, the precise scope of protection in cases involving unconstitutional orders remains contested. A court ruling of illegality could strengthen plaintiffs' cases. Second, the Justice Department could be pressured to investigate whether Trump abused his presidential authority. Even if criminal liability is unlikely given constitutional protections, a formal investigation could highlight misconduct, erode public trust, and expose him to reputational damage. If evidence emerged that Trump deliberately used troops for political gain rather than lawful purposes, legal scholars would argue this constituted abuse of power. Third, future legislative reforms might target Trump specifically. Congress, reacting to the precedent, could pass laws clarifying the limits of troop use in domestic contexts, explicitly citing the Chicago episode as justification. Such legislation would mark Trump's decisions as a cautionary tale and tether his legacy to unlawful overreach. The political consequences of a ruling against Trump could be severe. Even absent direct legal punishment, the perception that a president acted illegally in deploying troops would strike at the heart of his legitimacy. Trump's political brand relies heavily on portraying himself as a defender of law and order. If courts were to rule that he violated the law in attempting to maintain order, the contradiction would be glaring. His critics would point to the hypocrisy of claiming to uphold security while undermining the Constitution. For supporters in law enforcement and military communities, such a ruling could sow doubt about his judgment and reliability. Governor Pritzker's remarks reflected the sentiment of many Americans who saw troop deployment as not only unconstitutional, but also un-American. The court ruling would validate these concerns, solidifying public perception that Trump's actions were reckless and authoritarian. This could weaken his appeal among moderate voters and energize opposition movements, particularly those committed to civil liberties and state sovereignty. Moreover, Trump's political opponents would use the ruling to frame him as a threat to democracy. They would argue that his disregard for legal constraints illustrates a broader pattern of authoritarian impulses. This narrative could shape electoral campaigns, influence debates, and diminish Trump's ability to claim moral high ground in future political battles. A judicial declaration of illegality would also have major implications for federal-state relations. The American system is built on a delicate balance between federal power and state autonomy. When governors like Pritzker resist federal troop deployments, they assert the principle that states retain authority over local law enforcement unless extraordinary circumstances demand intervention. If courts side with Pritzker and against Trump, they reinforce state sovereignty and send a message that federal overreach will not be tolerated. This could embolden governors across the country to push back more aggressively against federal directives they view as unconstitutional. It would also reassure state governments that their consent remains essential in matters of domestic troop use. For Trump personally, such a ruling would represent a humiliating rebuke. It would show that his attempt to assert dominance over Illinois failed not just politically, but also legally. The image of a president being checked by courts and governors simultaneously would weaken the aura of power that Trump carefully cultivates. A ruling of illegality would also have consequences for the military institutions Trump sought to deploy. The National Guard is respected for its dual role, serving both state and federal missions. But when ordered into domestic law enforcement roles against their will, Guard members face deep ethical and practical challenges. Governor Pritzker noted that most Guard members do not want to patrol city streets, arrest citizens, or enforce civilian law. These are not the missions they trained for. If courts invalidate Trump's orders, it would reaffirm that troops should not be misused for political purposes. It would protect the reputation of the Guard and prevent them from being drawn into partisan conflicts. For military leaders, it would serve as a reminder that they must evaluate the legality of presidential orders and advise accordingly. Trump's actions already strained civil-military relations. A ruling against him would underscore the importance of maintaining boundaries between military and civilian authority. Beyond Trump himself, a ruling of illegality would carry symbolic weight for American democracy. It would reaffirm that even presidents are subject to the rule of law. The deployment of troops into cities without cause evokes images of authoritarian regimes, where armed forces suppress dissent and intimidate citizens. By striking down such actions, the courts would reinforce the democratic norm that domestic security is entrusted to civilian law enforcement accountable to elected leaders. This has particular resonance in the context of elections. Governor Pritzker warned that Trump's true intention was to disrupt free and fair elections. If courts rule against Trump, they implicitly reject attempts to manipulate security for political advantage. This would strengthen public confidence in the electoral process and demonstrate that institutional safeguards remain intact. If courts ultimately declare the troop use illegal, this episode will become a defining moment in Trump's legacy. Future historians will not view it merely as a tactical miscalculation, but as evidence of his disregard for constitutional limits. The Chicago deployment would be studied alongside other controversial exercises of presidential power, such as Nixon's abuses during Watergate or Bush-era debates over executive authority in the War on Terror. The narrative would emphasize Trump's willingness to test boundaries, even at the expense of democratic traditions. For supporters, he may remain a strong leader unafraid to act boldly. But for historians and legal scholars, the ruling would highlight the dangers of unchecked executive ambition. Trump's legacy would be shaped not only by policy achievements or failures, but by the lasting damage his actions inflicted on the norms of governance. If courts rule against Trump, several scenarios could unfold in the future. One scenario is minimal immediate impact but cumulative damage. The ruling may not result in criminal penalties or direct consequences for Trump. However, over time, the decision would reinforce the narrative of illegality and erode his standing among voters, legal institutions, and international observers. Each subsequent controversy would be interpreted through the lens of unlawful troop deployment. A second scenario is active legal and political fallout. Victims of unlawful arrests could pursue civil suits. Congressional committees might hold hearings on executive overreach. The media would highlight Trump's disregard for the Constitution, fueling debates in future campaigns. His political adversaries would seize the opportunity to frame him as a danger to democratic stability. A third scenario is preventive reform. In response to the ruling, Congress might pass laws restricting future presidents from unilaterally deploying troops domestically. This would be a direct legacy of Trump's actions and would mark his presidency as a catalyst for limiting executive power. Such reforms would further isolate Trump historically as a leader whose decisions triggered institutional pushback. The use of troops for domestic purposes is not unique to the United States. Historical and international comparisons provide perspective. In American history, presidents have occasionally deployed troops domestically, such as Eisenhower and Little Rock during school desegregation. But those cases were tied to clear constitutional imperatives and civil rights enforcement. Trump's case differs because it lacked lawful justification and targeted a state unwilling to consent. Internationally, troop deployment to suppress domestic dissent is often a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. Pritzker himself drew parallels to early stages of the Nazi regime, where paramilitary forces intimidated citizens and eroded freedoms. While the United States remains far from that level of authoritarianism, Trump's actions were seen as dangerous precursors. A court ruling against him would signal that America rejects such parallels and remains committed to democratic norms. In conclusion, if courts rule that Donald Trump's use of troops in Chicago was illegal, the consequences would be far-reaching. Legally, it would clarify the limits of presidential authority under the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act. Politically, it would damage Trump's credibility, weaken his claim to be the champion of law and order, and embolden his critics. Institutionally, it would strengthen state sovereignty, protect the military from misuse, and reinforce the principle of civilian law enforcement. Democratically, it would safeguard the integrity of elections and reaffirm the rule of law. For Donald Trump personally, the ruling would represent not just a setback, but a stain on his legacy. It would place him in the company of presidents remembered for overreach rather than leadership. It would ensure that the Chicago troop episode is studied as a warning of what happens when executive ambition collides with constitutional limits. Ultimately, the ruling would serve as a reminder that in the United States, no leader is above the law, and the preservation of democracy requires vigilance against those who would test its boundaries.